Let's see where to start. This is unscripted, okay? So a number of people have come over to me, some tonight, some earlier, and said, "Oh, I didn't know that your mother died when you were so young." So I've never been one to hide it. I don't have any reason to hide it, but it's also not necessarily, topic of conversation. Hey, by the way, nice to meet you. Here's my life story. But I've also recognized that much of who I am in life is an outgrowth, which is actually a good choice of words, of that experience in my life. Obviously, it was a significant framing of who I became and so on. And I actually bring it up in conversation whenever, as a rabbi, I need to be there to support someone who is going through a time of challenge. Because even though everybody's challenge is unique and everybody's navigating their own life challenge, but it's nice when you're struggling to know that someone else is on the boat with you, even if they're dealing with something different, but there's identification there. So when I read the book, when I read this book, I'll tell you the one thing that was like really new for me, but I knew all this stuff already, because my father taught it all to me. And really, I mean that only halfway tongue-in-cheek, but really I've had to, as I've navigated my own life journey, my father has been a source of support and helping me shape my values and my beliefs and so on. And so this is just a way to bring it all home and kind of set the stage for who I am in this conversation. I've had a lot of father-son conversations over the years about, philosophical things. I even have, I think I'm beginning of chapter 2. I get very, very prime territory in the book. Real estate, good real estate, chapter 2. This is my life story. So, in terms of how we're going to do a discussion tonight, I want it to be personal. I'm not really sure how that's going to play out, and I have a lot of questions that people presented, so I'm going to try to make it personal and try to make it a little bit raw and dig into places that maybe I haven't done so in the past. But before we do that, I have an opening question to set the stage for tonight, and that is, my opening question to you, Tati, is, why did you write this book? Or put in other words, what do you hope that one who reads this book will come away from reading this book? How will they be impacted by it? What was your hope in writing this book that the reader will experience and take away from this book? And I might take some notes if you say something that sparks a really good question. So, okay, the floor is yours.
36 years ago, when your mother passed away unexpectedly, not going to go into the abnormal challenges, the normal abnormal challenges that you have after a tragedy, but I was trying to figure out my own life. I was 38 years old, I was established, I was running a school, we had 400 students, blue ribbon, that's a national thing. We had 80 employees, that includes every person who was on the payroll, and 18 school buses. That's another discussion, how I got 18 school buses. Anyway, and in trying to figure out where I am in this, I had to do a lot of soul searching, and I consulted rabbis. I was looking for a good Jewish book. There are a few today, different than mine, but address the issues, but I couldn't find one that spoke to me. And I said, somebody ought to write that book. I gave a lecture series, you probably don't remember, 2 months after my wife passed away. The parent body of the school was not an observant parent body, probably 15–20% would count. This was 1986. The world has changed in a positive way, the Orthodox world, but then 20% maybe would consider themselves Orthodox. The rest were conservative, reform, or non-denominational, unaffiliated. But they knew my wife, Eliyahu's mother, very well, and she had 20 or 22 or 24 kids in her class for 15 years. And she raised a generation of young boys and girls, and she had an impact on the kids, and she had an impact on their parents, a profound impact. I just found out literally 3 weeks ago, did I tell you about? You remember the Goldstein family?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I found out 3 weeks, I got a call from a friend of mine in Florida that he had a guest for Shabbos who was a fiancé, you call a woman a fiancé also, or both are fiancé, who was staying there in his neighborhood in Miami, and he was talking to her, and what are you doing here, and who's your groom to be, and what's your name? I said, my name is Rachel. Oh, that's an interesting name. Yeah, my father named me after his second grade teacher. And my friend Davey figured it out and called me after Shabbos. And I called Chaim next day. I got his telephone number and I called him, did you? And he told me, and I didn't know that. It's a long time ago. Anyway, so that's the kind of impact, unscripted and unplanned, that he felt that deeply about that he named his daughter after his second grade teacher. So we were all in our own way in shock and needed answers. And I was the rabbi, and I had to give the answer. I was the rabbi and the person who would be the most fitting person to try to give them the answers. And I gave a lecture series for 7 weeks, once a week for 7 weeks, giving some elements, many elements of the book. I didn't get as personal then as I did in the book, but the ideas are classic and ancient, and from the Torah to the Talmud to Maimonides. I tried to put sources in so people can look it up and challenge me. That was my plan, not to write the book, but someone ought to write the book. But I kept keeping note. I lectured on it throughout the years, and finally a few years ago I said to myself, as it says in Pirkei Avos, Ethics of Our Fathers, if not now, when? And I did. And the Torah says that Adam was sentenced to hard labor. Well, I did 2 years of hard labor on writing this book. And thank God I saw it through to its conclusion. The goal is to provide that book for people who are struggling with tragedy, or it doesn't have to be tragedy, but everybody is impacted. Everybody we're Jewish, we have a value system, and we speak out. And we see injustice in the world, and if we're believers, we attribute the injustice, we attribute the result to God, because He has the ability to modify it, and if He doesn't, vicariously He is responsible. And hopefully this book will help people in that quest. And that was my goal.
All right, it's a good start. All right. So, I'm going to contextualize this question. Not long after I moved to Atlanta, there was a national story that happened here. There was a young man that was shot, dropping off his kid at preschool. And I went to pay a shiva call. And I was a young rabbi, and one of the family members, one of the immediate family members of this young man, I was sitting next to them, and they began to ask questions. Why would God do this? And why? And why? And I was really, really smart. I had all the answers. And I started giving the answers. And they asked me more questions, and I gave more answers. And then at one point, this person just picked themselves up and walked away from me. Just like that. They didn't say anything to me, just got up and walked away. And I knew that that wasn't what they were looking for. So you talk about anger in the opening, anger, being angry with God. And I think what I realized from that story, and I'm going to bring it home as a question, is that when people face real challenge and they ask why God, why, they don't always want the answer, or they don't want that answer. So, and I know for myself, there was a long period of my youth where I was angry with God, and I didn't want anybody to help me to stop being angry with God. So how do you lend support to someone who's in that state of, in that frame of mind, in that moment of anger? The best book seems to fall flat.
The question is real. Chapter 1 of the book is God's defense attorney. I got a call one morning. It was like 5 o'clock in the morning in California, and there was a young shliach. I don't remember where he was, but he was on the East Coast. And he calls me, he says, I need to speak to you right now, it's urgent. I said, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, it's 5 o'clock in California, it better be really urgent. He says, yeah, I got a call 2 hours ago from one of my balabatim, Mrs. So-and-so called me. I don't even know if I can say it in public. Her husband committed suicide that morning, and she was looking for him, found him in the garage, whatever. What do I tell them? That put me on the spot too. And I said, the first thing I said is, you are not God's defense attorney. That's the first thing. Don't take that responsibility, because you aren't hired to do that. You will fail. Help them. Just for the next week, just help them. Support them. Don't try to answer questions of that type. That's number one. But that story that Leo mentioned a moment ago in this question, if you've read it, you know what he was referring to. If not, I'll tell you the story, because that's the answer at this point. It was right here in Atlanta, and it was 12 years ago. Did you know yesterday was, 2 days ago was Levi Deitz's yahrzeit?
I missed that boat, yes.
12 years and probably a few months ago, what was happening here that I came in the middle of nowhere, came to visit your family? You had anybody bris? No, I can't figure it. Anyway, and I said, Leo, let's go out and just talk. And we went out, and Leo starts talking, complaining against God, ranting, that's the word they use. His first cousin, he was your age or a little younger, had a shliach in Virginia, Tyson's Corner. He had 4 kids, and he was dying from lung cancer, and he was telling me he's such a good guy, and he's so he is the best laugh of our class. You know, he's happy and jocular and so full of faith, but he's losing the battle. And why? Why? And like Elio said before, I'm the senior rabbi. And when I come to any of my kids and somebody says Rabbi Schusterman, two people turn around. I started in my mind formulating what I'm going to explain to Elio, and then I said to myself, just as I was ready to launch into my scholarly answer, I said to myself, whatever I'm going to say, he knows it already. He's a rabbi. He does the same thing. We're in the same business. And now I was stuck. What am I going to do? So I looked Elio in the eyes and I said, do you want an answer or do you want a hug? Not only he didn't expect that question, I didn't expect that question, but it just came to me from on high. Elio looked at me, his eyes teared up, and he said, I want a hug. And I gave him a hug. I haven't hugged him that way since he was a kid. I mean, at that point. We can make an appointment. Anyway, the point is that on one level, the question of tragedy is not coming from the mind. If you want to have a question about tragedy, take a course in theology, take a course in theodicy, if there is such courses, and you'll find out what all the wise men throughout history have said about theodicy. Theodicy means the study of God and evil. But for normal people, not theologians, and not philosophers, when they have that question, the question is a very personal one. I'm full of pain, and I don't know how to deal with the pain. The question, but they articulate it in a rational manner. But that's not the question. The question is not coming from their mind, the question is coming from their heart. Or maybe the question is coming from their gut, from their kishkis. It's a gut question. And the best mind answer will not address a gut question. But hugs do that, support does that, love does that, and that's the, we deal with issues in context. When you have a crisis, the crisis is front and center and consumes all of you, all of yourself, and a tragedy certainly does. You don't tell the person that is suffering the tragedy, this too shall pass. That would be cruel. And some part of it never passes. But for most of us, whether it takes a week, a month, a year, 3 years, 7 years, 10 years, life does go on, and you acclimate to yourself, whether you have a good answer or not. So the goal here is to see them through the crisis. And you see them through the crisis with emotional support. At a certain point, when they had the opportunity, the Talmud says, do not comfort a person while his deceased is before him. Because you're not going to accomplish anything. Not only won't you accomplish anything, you're going to rile them up. But when there's a distance, then they can be comforted. In the tradition of Shiva, the first 3 days, it is not recommended to come to a Shiva home in the first 3 days, unless you're a relative. That's the way, because it won't work. From 3 to 7, there's different periods, 7, 30, 11 months, 12 months, as we go through the grieving period. zoomed out and now has taken back responsibility of taking care of themselves with the pain, then it is possible to discuss philosophy, theology, answers. To my great surprise, I've gotten the book's been out on the market just this is self-serving, it's not a pitch, but I'm just telling you the facts. I've gotten a few calls from people who had tragedies in their family and were telling me how much the book helped. I didn't believe that the book could help, as I'm saying, when that close to the tragedy. And I'm sure when they have a little bit more distance, it may help more, but this gives a perspective.
I want to dig in a little bit deeper on that. Something struck me as you're talking. So, in our relationship with God, so we have an intellectual component. We study, especially if you hang around Chabad, we have a lot of Chabad philosophy, we read the text of Hasidus. So we have an intellectual relationship with God. We understand the components of the soul, the divine spheres, and so on and so forth. Then we have an emotional / soulful relationship with God, right? When you pray, you feel a connection on a soul level. But when you're in that moment of whether it's in the moment of shock or in the moment of pain, and the rabbi or the friend is there, providing that hug or that literal hug or the metaphoric hug, where's God in that equation? Where is, I guess, both from the one providing the support and the one in the moment, where's the God connection there? Does that make sense?
Yes. When my first wife passed away, right there in the lobby of the emergency room, when the doctor told me that we did the classic line, we did everything that we were able to, but your wife didn't make it. I've never said this in public, what I'm going to say now. The first thought that came through my mind was, this is not real. This is not happening to me. I never even won a door prize at a meeting. This is not true. That was the first silly thought that went through my mind in the most momentous event in my adult life. But we got through it. It didn't take long. And the next thought was, this is from God. This is not a random chance thing. This is part of a divine plan. And this is my test. If everything that I've learned and everything that I've believed in, can I live up to it in this going forward? And I'm still working it out. And then I had to deal with my family and the school and everything else, and then life was complicated. The truth of this book could have been written in one page. Wouldn't have sold much. And the book would have said, God runs the world. We can't understand God. We have to submit to God, and I hope things work out well for you. And if you read the book, make it through all the pages, somewhere in the book it says that too. But it gives you a frame of reference for it. And so one theme of the book is that one important theme of the book is that I'm not a psychologist, I'm a rabbi. One of the worst things that can happen to a person is to see himself as a victim. All criminals, I shouldn't say all, didn't do a study. When a person feels victimized, everything is justified. And when a person feels that God victimized him, he can blaspheme, he could be angry at God because it's justified. And from the emotional perspective, by God, it is justified. And you need to have the tools with which to find God in your tragedy. Rather than feeling abandoned by God, which is the instinctive approach, it comes naturally, to realize that God is in charge, and there's more to God than we can understand, and there's more to life than we can understand, and this has happened for a purpose. What is the purpose? I've been working on it for 36 and a half years to figure out what the purpose was. I haven't figured it out yet. But it serves a purpose. You want to dig deeper? I don't dwell on it much in the book, but I know what it says in Judaism. God is good, and therefore it is for the good. But for that, you have to be able to zoom out and get beyond yourself. I would never say that. People say that to people when they're sitting Shiva. That is one of the, I read a beautiful article from Maurice Lamb, if you know who he is. He's the author of The Jewish Way in Death and Mourning. He wrote a second book, but more behind the scenes of reading. And he has an article, 15 banalities that people say in a house of Shiva. Banalities is a very nice way of saying stupidity.
Like what bus number?
Yeah, but that's the way it is. We need to understand that we don't know why these things happen. No, so when we talk about the good that is in it, well, truth is, as to paraphrase the young Rabbi Schusterman, the tragedy that happened to him made him into the man that he is today. He would have probably been very good without this tragedy. I can vouch, he was a good kid before his mother passed away. And I knew there was good things in store for him in the future. But it changed him into being maybe wiser, maybe deeper, maybe more compassionate, and being able to lead and connect to people in a way that he wouldn't have had otherwise. Nothing about that means that, well, therefore,
Let's line up.
that justifies it. No way, Jose. But you can see that there are some positive events that may come from it. But ultimately, we have to submit and recognize, there's a common phrase, it's in Tillim, it's in Torah, God is with the sufferer in his sorrow, in his suffering, in his travail. That means, that is meant to say two things. Number one, you're not a victim. This is intended for you for a purpose. Whether you understand the purpose or not, that little distinction is a huge distinction. You're not a victim. You were chosen for a challenge. Abraham was chosen for 10 challenges. We are chosen for different kinds of challenges. But this is a direct message from God to you. Difficult as it is, are you up for that challenge?
I'm gonna interrupt you and go a little deeper, because you're not really answering my question.
I'm sorry.
Because the answer you just gave was a cerebral answer, and I'm talking about that moment when somebody is not in the place. So when I think about the book, somebody who's been able to zoom out and says, okay, I want to get to the core of this. They can read the book on their own, unpack, take this piece of it, identify, get angry at that piece of it. They can navigate that. But in the moment of suffering, in the moment of tragedy, when that first, when you're in it, you don't have the distance. The emotions are overwhelming. That's why it's cruel to tell somebody any of the theology. And I'm gonna pick on you a little bit.
Okay.
Because you're in the hot seat. So you said that your first thought was it's not really happening, and then you move to a cerebral place, which is this is, as you've told me, and I think everything that you've studied is now's your moment to either embrace it or not. I guess my question for you is, do you think that most people, see, for me there's a stage in between. I don't remember the 4 stages of grief, but there's a stage in between. So you started with denial and then went to rationalization, it sounds like. And I think there's the anger phase in between. There's like...
It's not linear.
Huh?
It's not linear.
It's not, I know it's not linear, thank you. But it's in the tantrum, right? It's in the tantrum that it's in the pain, it's in the anger, it's in the total breakdown that you don't really have space to say what this is happening for me, not to me. And so I guess I'm asking you in terms of your own experience. Maybe you didn't have the luxury to have that tantrum. Maybe you did, I don't know. I'm asking you, how do you deal with it in that moment of having a tantrum, if you had a tantrum in any way? I'm using tantrum because I identify with the brain turning off in that moment of disbelief, like the child who's throwing a tantrum that just can't reconcile what they're experiencing. And that's the moment where, whether you're the rabbi providing support or a friend providing support, or you're the one experiencing the tragedy and not knowing how do you even breathe? Like where's the God in that experience? Not an easy question, no?
Well, when you get a punch in your solar plexus, I actually wanted to use a different analogy, but it's not appropriate in this setting. You basically hold on. Men may have experienced this. You hold on for dear life. Don't move. When is that pain gonna go away? You don't think, you just are there in harmony with the pain. When a person has a tragedy, a certifiable tragedy, there's nothing, I repeat, there's nothing that will take the pain away, not answers, not even a hug. Well, people do cry and people do get hugged, and it's a temporary fix, but it doesn't really address anything. But it's like a salve on a wound, but the wound is there. That's why Dr. Kubler-Ross talked about the 5 stages of grief, including anger. And then the 5th stage is acceptance. Talking about myself, I skipped anger, went straight to acceptance, and paid a heavy price for it. You were 12 years old. I had 11 children. I had a school of 400 children, and I thank God have a strong emotional constitution that I was able to deal with my responsibilities and suppressing my own personal inner work. It was, these volcanoes that they talk about in Hawaii, yeah, there's murmurings and burbling going on for the last few years. Nobody knows when it's going to go, get over the top. I would have to say that I had that going on, trying to keep everything stable and together. And I did mention that I went to a therapist in Los Angeles. We live in Long Beach, it's 30 miles away from Los Angeles, for half a year. I had no time to go to a therapist. Every second week I took an hour. It was half an hour driving each way. Today it takes 45 minutes. And an hour with the therapist. And I insisted that this therapist has to be someone who lost a spouse and raised children by themselves. I didn't want to speak to some theologian or some smart psychologist. I wanted somebody who can feel what I'm going through. And it was very worthwhile. The name Bertha Simons. She was the therapist. She should have a look at Eden. But that was just to sort out the new definition of normal. It didn't deal with any of the inner things, and I convinced myself, boy, you really have it together. Until I didn't. And I had remarried a year and a half, 2 years later. I was in Jerusalem for the first time that my new wife and myself were able to take some time during the summer, ship the kids off to the overnight camps, except the little ones. We got somebody who can stay with them for 2 weeks. We went to Israel. And we were walking, where Rothschild Square is?
Not specifically.
Anyway, nice place, not far from the parking lot in the old city. Lovely, quiet place. And my wife asks me, Gershon, how are you? That's a strange question to ask. It was like 12 o'clock, it was noon time. It wasn't good morning, you came home from work. Gershon, how are you? I said, fine, Baruch Hashem. That kind of question gets that kind of an answer. Then she looks at me and says, how are you really? And that really dug into me, and I don't want to be dramatic, but the event was dramatic. I suddenly got dizzy, and Rothschild Square was revolving around me. I felt hot, and I started sweating. I didn't fall down, but I knew I was going through some kind of emotional overload, breakdown. I'm not quite sure how to diagnose it, but I knew I needed help. And I found a therapist in Yerushalayim, a woman from LA who I was vaguely acquainted with her, but she moved to Israel. She had her own private practice. And I spent 2 hours a day with her for the next few days talking about all these issues. And yes, I didn't deal with the anger. As long as we're talking about me, I wasn't angry at God, because Chabad Rabbi cannot be angry at God. But I gave God the cold shoulder. I put on film every day. I kept the rules as good or not good as I've kept them before. It didn't compromise my observance. I taught classes, but the person that I am distanced himself from God. You know, they tell a joke, you know, the Orthodox daven to God, and the more liberal ones daven to whom it may concern. I may have been davening to whom it may concern. I'm trying to figure out myself. Anyway, you get the point. That was my anger. Depression is anger turned inward. I don't know how to, I'll have to speak to a psychologist to help me put all these details together. But there is no doubt that I was angry at God, and I expressed it by maintaining my observance, but giving, that's the phrase that I can use. I gave God the cold shoulder. And after that, that changed. After that breakdown in Yerushalayim, things changed. And one of my kids asked me recently, how do you get over that? And I'll give you the answer, because I was thinking about it myself. Happily married couples aren't always happily married. Sometimes they have hiccups in their very happy marriage. And sometimes it's something very specific. You did this wrong, you did this, that wrong, and okay, I'm sorry, you're right, I apologize. Sometimes it gets more complicated, and it gets into one of those silent treatments. And that can go on, anybody who's not married, don't listen. That can go on for a day, or 2, or 3, and you can live in the same house. You can do all the regular routines, but everybody is sitting in their corner, in their self-righteous corner, and when is the other one going to apologize to me for what they did to me? It doesn't have to be a thing. It was a misunderstanding. It was if you've been married, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And how does that get resolved? Sometimes people who are not courageous, an incident of that can end the marriage. Maybe not the first time, the 4th time, it can be the end. I know of circumstances like that, people just didn't want to deal with it. But more often than not, it gets resolved, or the way it should get resolved is when the person realizes that the need for the relationship is infinitely more important to them than the apology that they are so desperately yearning for in the last 3 days. And then, if you time it well and you both realize it, it disappears, it ceases, and you are reunited. That's the ultimate relationship, the ultimate resolution of the challenge of where was God and where is God. The answer is, there is no answer that we can possibly understand. But we need God more than when we need an answer. And you say to God, I understand you, I don't understand you. We have some kind of calculation going on. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, after the Holocaust, said, we don't have to try to justify God. He owes us one. And leave it at that. In other words, don't try to work out the Holocaust theologically. It's not going to work. But we have to recognize that God is the architect of the tragedy, and it's for a purpose, even if you'll never understand the purpose. Why did God create Alpha Centauri? That's the star, the closest star to our solar system. The Hubble, the new telescope, the Webb telescope, is showing the depth of the greatness of the universe. Why did God need all of that? Isn't everything just about what happened at Sinai and Torah and mitzvahs? Isn't that the real focus of God's plan? No, I don't really know what the real focus of God's plan is. I know that for me as a person and as a Jew, the most important event for us as a Jewish nation is what happened at Sinai. What else is on God's agenda? I haven't the slightest idea. There's so much going. Just if you think about the great, how huge and how complicated the universe is, the overall universe, we have to understand, what do we know about God? Very, very little. We know of him what he explained, what he wants us to know, and he expressed it through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, through Torah, and that's where we fit into God's big plan. Anything else? And some things stay remote from us, we don't know. And that's what it means. God is with us in our tzara. He's with us. Even when we don't understand him, but we need him to hold our hand when we don't know what's going on. And if we hold on tight, we'll make it to the other side.
Good stuff, good stuff. One of the things that jumped out, and this is my last question, and then we'll have a few questions from the crowd, and we'll maybe do some kind of rapid fire questions. So one of the things that really jumped out at me in the book, like I said, I knew all of it before, just kidding. But one thing that really kind of stood out for me was the idea that being angry with God is actually a demonstration of that you have a real relationship with God. And what that meant for me is that a lot of people are afraid to have a real relationship with God, or don't really feel that close to God, that they could have a real relationship with God. And having a real relationship with God is sometimes being angry with God. My question for you is, you answered it a little bit, but maybe we can dig a drop deeper. So how has your relationship with God changed over the years? You said you gave God a cold shoulder, but the cold shoulder also could be closeness to God. So how did your relationship with God change over the years?
Well, my first decade it was like this, and in my sixth decade it was like that. No, cold shoulder is not anger, or it's anger, it's passive, and that's not healthy. An active anger is healthier than a passive anger. Elie Wiesel, I quote him in the book, Elie Wiesel says, a Jew must always be with God. You can be with God, you can be against God, but you can't be without God. Jewish anger against God is, God, I believe in you, and I believe in your justice, and what you've done to me seems unjust. Abraham said that to God 3 weeks ago in the Torah reading. God, this is inappropriate for you, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Moses, in a couple of weeks, we're going to read Shmos and Va'era. Moses comes to God and said, why have you done bad to your people? If you ever pay attention to the words in Tehillim and the Psalms, King David has a lot of complaints. But the complaints are the complaints of a child to a loving parent when the child perceives that the parent is not living up to the standard that they have demonstrated all along. To use a oversimplified analogy, have you ever experienced this yourself? You're certainly, where a child's with his mother in the supermarket, the child sees something that the child wants and says, "Mommy, get me that candy," or whatever it is. The mommy says, "No." And the child throws a full-blown tantrum. And then he builds up to a crescendo and says, "Mommy, I hate you." Wow. It never happened. It does happen. It does happen. And then, 4 minutes later, the child's walking around and sort of forgot the tantrum, bruises himself, and comes running to mommy. Mommy picks up the child and hugs the child, and the hate is a God memory. That is the relationship that a Jew has to have with God. And not everybody, but many people, even in the most tragic time in Auschwitz, went to the crematoria singing an imam, and I believe in God, which has to be giants of spirit or people who accessed the greatness of a Jewish soul, that even as they are walking into the crematorium, knowing that this is the end of their life, they pledge to God, I believe in you, and I'm looking forward for the coming of Mashiach. This is who we are, and this is what we have to work with. So anger, going back to anger, Mora says, black and white, a person is not held culpable for blasphemy that he expresses against God in a time of tragedy, in a time of loss. Because God has big shoulders and God understands. That's the limits. People sometimes have limits to what they can take. But the relationship is stronger than that. That's what we have to relate to, the ultimate relationship.
Okay, some quick questions, or they could be quick. Following a tragedy, it might be hard to still believe in God.
I'll try to answer quickly. That's the thing.
Following a tragedy, it might be hard to still believe in God when you do. But what do you say to people who don't?
You support them, you hug them figuratively and literally, and wait for the pain to subside, and then see what openings there are. It's interesting. Tel Aviv University did a study of Holocaust survivors, and they have a statistical number of religious people who lost their faith in the Holocaust, and they have a statistical number of non-religious Jews who became believers through the Holocaust. I was surprised to read that, but it was weighted more that people who lost their faith than people who found faith. But 14% of people who weren't believers going into the Holocaust became believers. That's how I recall the statistic. Because life is bigger than what we, if you live superficially, eat and drink and be merry, for tomorrow you may die, and nothing means anything. But when you're in the Holocaust, going through that for months and sometimes years, you have to ask yourself, what is going on? Why is this happening? And one of the answers might be that there's more going on than man can understand. And I have to connect to that, to justify that. For my own conscience, I have to justify it by connecting to the source of this, even this travail.
Which answers the next question, why have the Jewish people had to suffer so terribly and for so long?
Somebody needed to be the suffering servant, and all the other nations stepped back, and we didn't step back fast enough. Jewish history starts with Avram Avinu, with Abraham. Again, we just learned this in Chumash in the last few weeks. God told Abraham when he was 70 years old, 30 years before Isaac was born, your descendants will be slaves in a land not their own for 430 years. That was the Egyptian exile. Just that statement. Abraham was doing his best to promulgate godliness in the world. It was him and Sarah, that's it. Those were the only, quote, authentic Jews at that time. And they were bringing people in and educating them. Isaac wasn't born. Nobody else, they didn't exist. And already, this is their destiny. It cannot be for suffering. Anybody, we don't have to interpret suffering as punishment. I'm not God's bookkeeper. I'm not his attorney. I'm not his bookkeeper. We don't have to interpret suffering for punishment. The announcement in that covenant with Abraham clearly demonstrates that. And I'll give you one little thought about the book of Job, the book of Eov, where Eov suffered. Eov suffered immensely. He had a wife, he had 10 children, he had wealth, and Satan, I shouldn't say Satan, the Satan, because the Jewish concept of Satan is not the same as the American/Christian concept of Satan, so I'd rather use the term Satan. Challenged God and said, God was proud of Eov and said to the Satan, have you seen my servant Eov, how faithful he is? He says, yeah, he got it made. And, the Satan threw down the gauntlet and God picked it up and said, okay, do with him as you see fit, and by golly, Eov did not reject God, but he got very angry at God and he spoke out against God. And 3 of his friends came to comfort him. And the whole book, not the whole book, but the next 36 or 37, 36 chapters are the discussion between his friends and Eov. And you know what his friend said? God is in charge. You are suffering. You are a sinner. That's it. And Eov defended himself. I'm not a sinner. I'm back and forth. And it's a hard book to learn because it's very deep and very complicated and very philosophical and theological and theodiceical, however you say. There's no such word, but I'm making the word theodicy. And at the end, God doesn't answer the question. He doesn't say, well, it was a game I was playing with the Satan, and you were the victim, you were the fall guy, you were the shlomazel that the soup spilled on. You didn't do anything wrong. He didn't tell that to him. Nor did he give him an answer. The last 2 chapters are, God just describes in beautiful Hebrew poetry, what do you know about the world? What do you know about creation? And it's a whole beautiful explanation that man can't understand God. And he submitted to that. And then God spoke to his 3 friends and said to them, you guys, who gave you the right to tell Eov that he was a sinner? He wasn't a sinner. And don't ever say something like that and ask Eov to pray for you so I don't do something bad to you. And there's a din in the Shulchan Aruch, in the code of Jewish law, it is forbidden to tell a person who is suffering that he is suffering because he sinned. It is forbidden to say that. What do you know about God's plan? We don't.
All right. Questions? Steve?
First, a statement. I forgot what it was. With Kubler-Ross, I feel like if she wrote her book 60 years later, today, she would be seeking your approbation. My second question is, throughout your brief,
one sentence. The world would be a lot healthier today if people believed in God. I'll even say any God. But today we live in a nihilistic world where there's no deity and no higher power. That's one of the reasons the world looks like it looks today. Okay, back to you.
Okay, just one more question. Assuming something that is impossible, let's assume you had the same amount of time a month after your wife passed away. 3 months, a year, 3 years, 5 years. At what point do you think you could have written this book? Would it have been 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or could it only have been written for 2022 publication?
Well,
Good question.
the first thing I will say is, since it was published in 2022, obviously that was the divine plan.
Well, it said you've been working on it for a while, but
The truth is, every one of us, hopefully, is not the same person they were 5 years ago. And hopefully, 5 years from now, we will be wiser than we are today. Now, if I would have written it when I was 45, I don't think it would have the texture that it has. I've celebrated my 39th birthday 3 times plus. So there's, I hope getting older doesn't necessarily mean you get wiser, it just means you get older. Hopefully, I've learned something in the last many decades, and I'm a different person today. And raising 11 children taught me a lot too, and especially raising a Leo.
Questions?
If you say in Proverbs 2, we don't know God, if you say we don't know God and we never will know God, I understand that. Should we try to know God in our own very finite way? Should we make an attempt to know God as little as we are? Is that something that Judaism promotes?
Absolutely, yeah. Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. I want to give you a quote. King David, we're sitting here, father and son, in Divrei Hayamim, which is translated as Chronicles, where Ezra wrote the history of the Jewish people. He talks about when King David was giving over the reins of being the Jewish king to King Solomon. So King David was the even though there was King Saul before, but we consider King David to be the ultimate king, and King Solomon was the wisest. So that's the transition. This is what I'm going to quote. I had notes from a different lecture. I just want to give you the quote verbatim. Va'ata Shlomo bini, and you, Solomon, my son. Da'as Elokei avicha, know the God of your father. Ve'ovdeo b'lev of Sholem, and serve him with complete heart, u'benefesh chafetza, and with an eager soul. He called levaves deresh Hashem, For God examines all hearts, v'chol yetzer machshavos mevin, and understands the thought of every creation. In tidrashanu yimotzi loch, if you seek him, he will be found by you. God the transcendent is transcendent. But God the, this is a word that not used that common, but it's God the immanent, not that's going to happen imminently, but immanent means the God that is present in the world. That is God who channels himself to relate to the world and wants the world to relate to him. The Torah and mitzvahs that we are given, 613 commandments, that is where God channeled himself so that we have 613 ways to relate to him. And then there's one overall foundation in all the mitzvahs, and that is we're doing it because this is the will of God. The will of God is universal. The specific meaning of mezuzah and tefillin and candle lighting and kosher, that's the imminent, and that's the universal. Yes, it's Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu. Hear, O Israel, Hashem, the name that we don't pronounce, that is God the transcendent. Elokeinu means he is our strength. God channels his infinity to each and every one of us and gives us strength. So there are two aspects of God, and we have to, faith is to submit to the transcendent God, and enthusiasm, know the God of your Father and serve him with a complete heart and an eager soul. That's our mission.
Nice. Anybody on this side? Questions?
Both of you had quite a journey, it's spiritual, emotional, and I guess I'd like each of you to maybe take a second and tell us how your relationship with God changed through this experience. I mean, when it happened to you as a 12-year-old, I'm guessing your spiritual self was not that evolved, but yours probably was at a certain point. And you talk about distancing yourself with God. I think that's part of the experience with God. We have a living God who's with us throughout our lives. I guess that's one idea. So could you maybe address that? How this experience?
Start from the local rabbi.
So I don't know what it would have looked like had I not had this experience, but what I would say is that having to navigate this forced me to investigate what my relationship with God was, or is, or evolved into being. There's a lot of people that roam the earth that we pass every single day, and we have a theoretical relationship with them, but we don't have to really engage with them. We don't have to figure out what our relationship with them is, because we have nothing to do with them. And for a lot of people, I think that's how God factors into their lives, and that might have been for me, other than what I maybe would have, initiated on my own, because, being a Chabad Chassid and studying these teachings and navigating in some kind of abstract idea was, but I think in needing to face the challenge, and obviously it was different when I was 12 and when I was, in that tantrum stage, not even being fully developed, to becoming an adult, and and I think it continues to evolve. I don't think I've got my relationship with God figured out, but it's definitely evolved, and I personally feel a very I don't know if the right word, if kinship is an appropriate word, but I feel a closeness to God. Like I feel close with God. When I say close, like I can get angry at him and I can talk to him and I could ignore him, and and he factors into my life. And every now and then something happens that challenges me in my life, and I find myself kind of off kilter, and I have to question myself, wait, are you really in a relationship with God? If you are, then go back to your relationship. Like, is this just a figment of my imagination? Is it an excuse or whatever? So I don't, so what I'm saying is, and directly answering your question, I think that obviously this is a significant part of my history, who I am as a person. It's what shaped me, and it's not something that dominates my thinking at this stage of my life. It has over the years. There were times where, as I became more self-aware, I had to really look at that event and really try to unpack it and understand it for myself, and for my relationship with God, and for my relationship with my father, and for my relationship with my mother, and my relationship with my siblings, and my wife, and my kids, and it all factors in. So, it gets revisited. But then you navigate that, and you move on with your life, and your relationship is what it is. So, I kind of am answering your question.
Yeah, the journey with God.
Yeah.
And as they say, the journey is the destination. But for my part, I will say, I've shared with you the markers of the stages that I went through. I grew up in a good European raised, my parents were European. I was born in France. I don't know what that makes me. If the cat has the kittens in the oven, are they muffins? Anyway, so I grew up in a Bavitcher home. I went to yeshiva in Brooklyn, and I stood at the Rebbe's Farbrengens from the time I was 11 years old when I moved to Crown Heights until I left to California in 1971. I had a good grounding in relating to God, Torah, Yiddishkeit, the works. And I could have just proceeded along those lines. I wouldn't use the word hiccup because that doesn't do it justice, but the loss of my wife in 1986 was an earthquake, a major upheaval. And as I said, I had my issues with God. But using the relationship with God, using the analogy of a marriage, and because in Torah, God is the husband and the Jews are the wife. That's mentioned in countless places, and that's how our relationship is. We're on the receiving end from God. Psychologists say that a marriage doesn't reach its true bonding until, and there are two examples that are given. One, when you stay up all night with a child burning up with a fever, or to be more dramatic, at the bedside of your child in the hospital, and husband and wife are there, and they don't know where their life is going to go if this doesn't have a decent ending. And then that togetherness crisis, being together in that crisis, bonds them. But the other is when they have a good, serious fight. And then they reconcile. Then, to some extent, one might say, the bond is deeper because the marriage has been tested and it survived. And that when a person goes through a challenge with God, and instead of taking the left lane, you take the right lane and reunite, it does end up deeper,
organization from the Lubavitcher area. It just occurred to me, I don't remember in the book you saying that you wrote a letter and got a reply to this earthquake in your life from the Rebbe, or did anybody ever write to the Rebbe who was still the Rebbe then? Or did he offer you any guidance?
It is in the book.
I'm sorry.
You'll have to review it.
After
No, but
reading it?
I'll tell you, and because you're asking, I will tell you a little bit more that I didn't write about in the book. I don't know if I want to commit it in print. I did write to the Rebbe. I wrote it to the Rebbe. This was about 6 weeks after my wife, no, it was about 2 months after my wife passed away. And I went to New York to, I had committed earlier to speak for the Lubavitch, the women's annual convention. And after my wife passed, which is usually the weekend before Shavuos, and my wife passed away 10 days before Pesach, and I had a great decision to make. I had every reason not to go speak. And nobody would hold it against me. But I thought that instead of chickening out, I actually spoke about, my wife's name is Rachel Leah, and the talk that I gave was on the meaning of Rachel and Leah, the two sisters, and their conflict, which is in the Torah reading of these weeks. And I spoke about her. But so being in New York then, I had, at least for 48 hours, I had an opportunity to write to the Rebbe, and I wrote what's going on. I wrote how the kids are, and I won't tell you everything there, but and how I felt about the challenge. The Rebbe answered me. The Rebbe said, when God gives a person a holy mission, he certainly gives him the strength and the ability to fulfill that mission properly. And the Rebbe added, that means with joy. Then the Rebbe added, especially when the mission includes doing the role of a mother to the extent possible. That was the Rebbe's answer. And then I will tell you, I was not very happy with that answer. Because I wanted sympathy. I wanted empathy. I wanted a hug. The Rebbe gave me marching orders. Yeah, he put in some nice words there. Simcha. I was not happy. It took me a few months to accept the fact that the Rebbe is not treating me like a kid. He's treating me like a man. And he was talking to me man to man. When I came to that realization, I appreciate the absolute truth and honesty and straightforwardness in the Rebbe's answer.
How did you come to that conclusion? Did it just happen that you came to that conclusion and you're talking about it? Did you work on it to try to figure it out, or was it a gift from God?
No, I'm not a prophet. I don't get gifts from God that way. It was eating away at me, and I was thinking about it for weeks, maybe even months. Why didn't the Rebbe give me what I wanted? And I realized, I figured out, I know who the Rebbe is. He was wise and smart and godly and caring. So why didn't he give me the caring that I wanted? Because you're not a baby. You're an adult, and you have a job. I had a lot of responsibilities then, and he didn't want to coddle me, he wanted to tell me what my mission is.
All right, does anybody have like a really light question?
Not in this room.
Who's your favorite child?
Rabbi, where are you in the birth order of the 11?
Number two.
You're number two?
Number two. All right, so I'm trying to think how we can end like with a joke or a light story. Anyway, it's thank you for again, thank you all for being here and for engaging in the conversation. Thank you, Dati, for engaging. And I think you have another 10 children to go do lectures at. We'll get all the answers by the time we're done the whole. Those of you that would like your book inscribed, you are welcome to come up here and have your book inscribed. I think there may be a few more available. What did you say? Said you should buy 2 books, one for yourself and one to give. Oh, Michigan Kesselman, yes. So there are more books available if you want to. If you know someone who could use the book, and pretty much everybody can use the book. All right, thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful evening. Good Shabbos. See you all soon.
It's just the X and then